This program was made possible by the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the National Educational Telecommunications Association, the National Endowment for the Arts, the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, and the New Jersey State Council on the Arts.
You would ask people who never went to a museum or never went to an art gallery who Ben Shahn was, and they would know. He was a popular figure, and not just an artist. He was on radio, he was on television. He charmed an audience.
He's a perfect artist in a way for right now, because it's a mixture of realism and politics and abstraction. All these things that young artists are doing right now.
Shahn was an example of a socially engaged artist who was able to use painting, photography, and many other types of media to convey his messages to society.
I remember he said in one of his Harvard lectures, he found there are no masses, there are great aggregations of individuals, but they're all individuals.
A running theme throughout his work is this identification with the outsider, with the marginal elements, with the victims of the powers that be. That never changes.
Most images that I knew were the images pertaining to and around the crucifixion. And I began to feel, justly or otherwise, that what was happening in the Sacco Vanzetti situation was a crucifixion. And on 2 occasions I was up here picketing among thousands of other people before the execution, and on the night of the execution I wept, you know. And but it wasn't until almost 2 years later that I felt that one dared take as topical a thing of that and use it as an object of art, or as a subject for an art expression.
Sacco and Vanzetti were 2 Italian-American anarchists. They were accused of being responsible for the murder and the robbery of a paymaster and a guard in a shoe factory in Braintree, Massachusetts. And between 1920, when they were arrested, and 1927, when they were executed, it really became the cause célèbre, not just in the United States, but worldwide. I think it doesn't matter whether they were guilty or not. What we do know is that they did not receive a fair trial, and that they were the victims of kind of anti-Italian, anti-immigrant feeling at that time. Up to the Sacco Vanzetti series, socially engaged art in the United States had a connection with 19th century illustration, the work of the Ashcan school artists like John Sloan. With Shahn, you have this synthesis with a modern understanding of painting, you know, somebody who had seen Cezanne and Picasso and Matisse, and this very clear-eyed humanist political point of view.
This was a scene of somebody mourning over the deaths of 2 individuals, but the insincerity of the mourning struck me. And also in terms of style, you know, kind of modernist, so that you knew there was a recession into space, but then he was able to kind of tip things up, so it seemed like a very flat surface. And Shahn isn't someone who is usually talked about as doing that, but I think he was doing it very effectively. What separated him out from all the other people who were doing it was his concern with content. His attempt to focus on a particular aspect of America, the experience of immigrants, the system of justice or injustice that was in this country, allowed him to develop a sense of America as this potential place of freedom and democracy, that even though there's oppression there, there's also a legal system that can be challenged when it doesn't live up to his ideals of democracy and freedom and justice.
He found he wanted to tell stories with his art, first of all, and he also wanted to use art as a social tool. He was born in Kovno in Lithuania, near Russia, and after he was less than 2 years old, he moved to a smaller town called Vilkomir, which is really where he grew up. His father had left when he was 4 years old. He had been exiled to Siberia for anti-Tsar activities, for being a political radical.
Here they are, Jewish in Lithuania under Russian domination. So all of those things, I think, come into play with his very profound and lifelong identification with the underdog.
There was a huge wave of anti-Semitism in Russia, and there was massive immigration to the United States. When Ben went to America, he was 8 in 1906. It was a tremendous change, not only a new country, a new language, a new social situation, but a reunion with his father.
Can you remember being an immigrant yourself?
Oh, vividly. Vividly, yes.
Where were you an immigrant from?
I was an immigrant from Russia. I landed in Boston, but we were brought down immediately to Manhattan, New York. And there, for the first time in my life, I saw people with gold teeth, and I thought, what a wealthy country. But on the same day, I saw an elevated train, which seemed incredible. Yes, I remember it very vividly.
Photographing the streets of the Lower East Side in the 1930s was a way of going back to his own childhood. People that he witnessed, the immigrants sitting on stoops, the vendors selling wares, the children playing in the back alleys, all of those sights were very familiar to him as an immigrant, working-class child growing up in Brooklyn. He was largely self-trained as a photographer, but that was enough for him. That was really all he needed. Through the lens of the camera and against this tenement backdrop, it all adds up to a kind of memory, really, a sort of memory of some of the loneliness that he experienced as an immigrant child.
His mother decided that he would have to quit school and get a job so he could support the family and his younger brother, Philip. And Ben very much resented that. He loved education. He loved the idea of learning. He worked, I think, from the age of 14 on in a lithography workshop where he had to learn to draw. He was working. He was also studying. He was a very diligent young man. And while he was at school, he met Tilly Goldstein, and they fell in love, and they married when Ben was 24. Every artist at the time wanted to go to Europe. This was in the mid-20s. That was their goal. Their dream was to earn enough money to go to Europe. Largely on Tilly's earnings, they went. He did drawings of churches throughout Italy where they traveled. He spent almost a year in North Africa. He also studied a great deal. He studied in Paris. So for him to spend months in Paris, and nobody knows how many, but he spent several months in Paris, was a gigantic education.
He was impressed by modernist painting and the kinds of experimentation that was going on. You can look at his early work and see how he tries out some of Cézanne's style, and he tries out a little bit of Matisse. He was particularly impressed by Giotto. He loved the frescoes of Giotto and other 14th, 15th century Italian mural painters. And then he just decided that even more important than trying to choose a style was, for him, looking at what he wanted to paint. And he realized that he wanted to paint stories.
I ran into a very bad period where I questioned the whole business of what I had learned and whether it has anything to do with me, I, a storyteller. What have I to do with a lot of Cézanne's principles? He brought up in the classics. I brought up in some little ghetto village in Russia. We had nothing in common, and I sat down and for myself made a kind of a balance sheet. Who am I? What is my background? And what can I do, even if it is a fault? I was told storytelling is not art. But I had to admit that and make the best of it.
The summer house they got just before going to Europe on that first trip in 1924 It was hardly a house, it was a broken down shack in Truro at the tip of Cape Cod in Massachusetts, and the house remains today in the family. They had had a child, Judith, just before they came back to America in 1929. Then they settled in Truro.
Truro was quite different then. For example, none of the roads in this part of Truro were paved. They were all sand roads. We spent summers here, but there was one winter, and it must have been before Ezra was born, that my mother told me that they didn't have enough money for the car fare back to the city, so we stayed here into November. This was an uninsulated, unheated house. It must have been awfully cold, and we ate clams mostly, which my father dug.
The summer of '31, he really developed as an artist for the first time. He also developed a strong friendship with Walker Evans, the photographer, and they influenced each other.
He stayed in this house. There are a couple of portraits that have been painted of him where the furniture is recognizable. It's still around somewhere.
They decided to put on an exhibition. Walker Evans would do photographs, and Ben did these drawings of the Dreyfus Case.
Of course, the Dreyfus Case is a 19th century case. It's French. It dealt with the issue of anti-Semitism. He had bought a book the last time he was in France, which had photographs of all the leading players in the Dreyfus Case. And so he did a kind of straightforward portraiture series. Here he is dealing with a social-political theme, and he's thinking about it in a kind of organized pictorial narrative. But that's about it. I think it's just a kind of way to get to Sacco and Vanzetti, because then when he gets to Sacco and Vanzetti, he does a great deal of research. He uses photography from the case itself. He, in effect, edits what he's using and not using. And in the process, he comes up with this very personal, figurative style. It is no longer Shahn reflecting on his experience as a modernist in Paris. This is Shahn using his own very American visual vocabulary.
And these were the first works of his to really attract attention, and they made him famous.
Many people found his Sacco and Vanzetti series, at least individuals on the left and members of the Sacco and Vanzetti club in Little Italy, found that he didn't heroize his figures enough, that they were too mundane in a way. They were sitting in their chairs in court, looking somewhat, one might say, apprehensive about their fate. And that's certainly not what you want if you want to celebrate someone as a martyr, as a hero to your cause. But Shahn was interested in those little moments. Just like he always talked about, he wanted the detail, the way the coat folded.
So he'd already been looking at newspaper photographs for a kind of documentary detail that would give a kind of authenticity to his painting. And so photography was a great vehicle to capture documentary detail. Walker Evans was probably the most important influence for Shahn as a photographer. He shared studio space with Walker Evans, and that relationship was a very formative one because it exposed Shahn to casual street photography. It enabled him to at once see what was going on in the world around him, but also to gather material that would be useful for his art down the road.
Rivera saw the Sacco Vanzetti show and was very much impressed by it. Diego Rivera was one of the most important Mexican muralists who flourished at the time, and they were very important not only in Mexico, but became so here. Rivera was commissioned by the Rockefeller family to do a large fresco for the entrance to one of the buildings of the newly created Rockefeller Center. He contacted Ben and asked if Ben wanted to be an assistant. And Ben jumped at the opportunity.
Rivera painted a portrait of Lenin. Nelson Rockefeller asked him to remove it. He said no, and of course the mural was destroyed, and Rivera was paid off. I think that was a crystallizing moment for an artist like Shahn, for a lot of artists at that time, which showed you the limits of patronage.
I was writing the art stuff on the Ohio State Journal in Columbus, Ohio. And I talked to my editor and said, why don't I go to New York and interview Rivera? And he said, that's a good idea, so I did. I went up to meet Rivera, and his assistant turned out to be Ben Shahn.
And there she met Ben and told him how excited she was by his work, that she had finally found somebody who could express political thoughts through his art and be effective. Bernarda represented everything that Ben wasn't and that Tilly wasn't. She was from a very highly educated Midwestern family, Protestants, progressives socially and politically, but also solid Midwesterners. Ben came from a family from the shtetl in Eastern Europe. They lived a different life. His marriage was clearly on the rocks. He just wanted out. He wanted out from his background. And along came this very attractive, very intelligent woman from Ohio.
I can only say years later that it was obviously devastating. But it didn't happen all at once. He didn't walk out one day and we never saw him again. It was a more gradual process. But we saw less and less of him.
And then began the next stage in his life, professionally as well as personally. He was offered a job, and it meant he would have to move to Washington. Ben was hired as a photographer, and he had only dabbled in photography, done some very beautiful photography. The photographic assignments were for the Resettlement Administration, whose job was to inform the public as well as the Congress of the true conditions of the poverty, the desolation of the South during the Depression.
There were about 11 photographers being hired, all of them very, very well-known photographers at that point, except Ben, who was an artist. Walker Evans was already on the project, and Walker was a great friend of Ben's. In fact, he had first inspired him to take photographs at all. Ben said, well, I don't know how to drive. And so he asked me whether I would drive for him, and I said I certainly would.
And she arrived in Washington, and they went off on a trip through the South, and they were together from then on.
We drove west from Washington. We drove into Pennsylvania, and there were 4 young guys walking along, carrying musical instruments. And Ben said to me, you should stop the car, I want to talk to these guys. And it wound up with these fellows sitting on a leafy bank, and they were playing, American folk songs that Ben had never heard before. He was so overwhelmed with those young fellows, They were minors, they were uneducated, they were brilliant, they were funny. The first painting that he made that had to do with that trip was called Pretty Girl Milking a Cow. That was one of the songs they sang.
He was warm, he was compassionate, he genuinely liked people, and he sympathized profoundly with their hardships. And he could get people to talk. Ben was a big talker himself, but he was able to make contact with people and get them to open up.
These were people who you knew had a great deal of self-respect. In fact, I must say that no matter how poor the people were whom we met in the South, we always encountered that great sense of self-respect, dignity.
This brings us to the sense of injustice that runs through a great deal of your art.
Well, I have been given all sorts of names and belonging to all sorts of schools. And I think most of them could be cliches, or they become so very quickly. One of them is social realism.
Another is protest. I'm sure these are
protest art and all of those things. And I, like anyone else, am, I hope, moved by injustice.
I think Shahn was a social realist. The label itself talks about both content and style. I mean, social meaning an artist who really addresses particular social issues. and realist meaning an artist who does so in a style that is recognizable. He himself rejected the label, or at least he said that after the mid-late 30s, after he'd done his trips across the country or the South and the Midwest as a photographer for the federal government, that his social realism turned into something that he called personal realism, where he really came to know individual people and the way in which they were struggling to cope with the Depression.
Shahn loved to use the right-angle viewfinder device. It was a type of periscope that he would attach to his Leica, which enabled him to take people off guard. He would stand in a certain direction and take photographs to what was at the right of his lens.
He used an angle finder and me, because I would stand here and he would point the camera at me, but he was not photographing me. He was photographing the people over there. And he has, he said this is dishonest, but I'm going to do it anyway because it's the only way to get people relaxed. But you often see them all looking like this, and they're the ones who are being photographed, not the person they're looking at.
Shahn was photographing for the government in the spirit of social reform. These photographs were used to educate the American people about the poverty and the conditions of life for farmers and sharecroppers throughout the South.
He was very pleased with what he was doing because he felt he was doing something that was helping, and it was helping. The country was in terrible trouble after the Depression, and Roosevelt showed though an aristocrat himself, showed this tremendous affinity for the underprivileged, and the same thing that Ben felt. And Ben was 100% New Dealer and 100% behind the president.
They also had a personal value for Shahn because he was photographing always, I believe, with the eye that he was collecting material for future use. But they were never transcribed in a literal way. Shahn's use of photography involves gathering features, subjects, forms from several different photographs, which he then combines in an almost montage fashion to make a painting.
He stopped in 1938, which was the last trip he took for the Resettlement Administration in Ohio. He felt he was a prisoner of his camera, that his art was being limited by his camera, that he could not fully express himself by means of photos. Painting was his love. Painting and drawing were the means by which he could express himself best. The photographs are excellent photographs, and I think he will increasingly be known as a first-rate photographer, but his painting was the most important to him. Ben and Bernarda were living in Washington, and they were still working for the government. They became friends with the German-born architect who was living in the States then, and who had been involved in the establishment of a planned community called Jersey Homesteads, now known as Roosevelt, in northern New Jersey. And this architect wanted a mural done for the town.
So he said to Ben, Ben, you wanted to do a fresco mural, why don't you do it in my town? He said, I'll drive you and Bernarda up there if you'd like to go. So we drove up here, and the place was big piles of earth, partly built houses, some finished houses, but the atmosphere of the place was fantastic.
And I began with these people. Who are they? They're 99% of them are immigrants. And I began with the theme of immigration. And I thought, why do people migrate? There are economic reasons, there are social reasons, there are political reasons. Way up in the corner, at the very extreme left, you see some of the Nazi symbols, of the verboten signs, of going to the shopkeeper who is Jewish, or the doctor who might be Jewish. And instead of using a less familiar symbol, I use the symbols of Sacco and Vanzetti, whose execution, I felt, was the result of this kind of persecution, and mixed with mourners who might be Jewish. It's a confused symbol, but to me it became a very beautiful symbol.
And it took about a year or two to do, but it was very wonderful for me because I had certainly never had any experience with fresco before. I did one full portrait in that mural, but the rest of it was just mostly detail. But I certainly learned everything that I've ever known about fresco then from Ben. The way fresco works is that you work in color that has no binder whatsoever except water. And you work with water and the colors you want, and on wet plaster. In a sense, it's a sort of monumental technique. But Ben he really did like monumental themes, and he liked to participate in what he felt was a cause of a great deal of significance.
There's the campaign poster of 1936 of Roosevelt looking down and being the source of inspiration, etc., etc. Way up in the upper right-hand corner is the idyllic dream. There would be the farm and the factory working in unison, and everything would just be lovely. Unfortunately, even while I was working on it, the situation was becoming more and more disastrous economically in the country, and the effort of all our planners to create an island of security in a sea of economic disaster failed.
Though the government had sold all the houses off to the people because their original premise had not worked. But the houses were beautiful, and like this one, I mean, very simple, but very, very nice.
Actually, I was the one who wanted to move here. Ben was pretty much a city fellow. I found there was a charm about this place. I didn't hear any English at all. It was either Russian, Polish, Yiddish, or German. From there, it was fascinating. Sometimes I would get a little bit lonely, but people were very, very nice to me, and they thought I was a strange oddity. I love this town. I've loved it ever since we first moved here.
The Shahns were very, very busy. Ben was painting, Bernarda was doing illustrations, and there were 3 children, and then other people would come out here. You would walk into the Shahn's house, and there would be 6 people at breakfast with Bernarda serving these elegant little omelets and Ben talking and people listening, so that Bernarda didn't really have much time to do her own work. But Ben was very adamant about keeping his work going in the studio, and people did not enter the studio.
If Ben was doing something, he was absolutely unaware of time, I think. For instance, I've seen him sit at a table for 17 hours when he was, getting something done that he wanted to go through with.
But if he had a painting that he wanted someone to see, like my husband, who was a good friend of his, he would say, "Ed, come on in and take a look at this." I mean, it was like going into a sanctuary. Unless you got invited to see a new painting, just Ben was in the studio. Bernarda, I'm sure, but the children hardly ever went into the studio.
I've never brought up children in my life. They grew up. We came to an understanding with them very early. If they'll let us alone, we'll let them alone. And that was the extent of it,
And it worked just one way.
And I guess we did the right thing because they left home very early.
Oh, Ben, don't say that. No, they haven't left home.
Yes, they have.
And no, they're on their own. They became independent really very early, all of them. I tried togetherness for a while, didn't work.
Oh, they're very nice and
When I met them,
A very different picture. They're very
it
nice
was very
people.
much Ben Shahn and his wife. She really didn't speak that much. She was always an extremely charming woman and a very bright one. But it was Ben's show. They obviously were very compatible. They were both very intelligent people. Both had this tremendous intellectual curiosity.
Sometimes we would sit down at 9 o'clock in the morning and still be talking at 2 in the afternoon. But at other times we wouldn't speak to each other for 2 weeks. You know, we were both of us very strong-willed people, and I'm amazed that we both came out alive.
He was a very elegant man, personally. His speech was beautiful. He spoke beautifully. He was really very, very warm. And he was very, very arrogant. A very talented man and a very dedicated one. He had a political position, which he took through his art.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
He was definitely a supporter of Roosevelt and the New Deal. And I think that's where his politics really lie.
Give me your help not to win votes alone, but to win in this crusade to restore America to its own people.
The freedom to have health care and housing and work and leisure time. This was what the Social Security mural was all about. And he showed on one side what it was like without Social Security, and on the other side what it meant to have that. So his interest in murals was very connected to his interest in helping the Roosevelt administration.
If the people during these past few years had chosen a reactionary administration or a do-nothing Congress, Social Security would still be in the conversational stage, a beautiful dream which might come true in the dim, distant future.
He began the mural before Pearl Harbor, and then once the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor and the U.S. entered the Second World War, the whole mural took on another dimension. He was there celebrating not simply what America was, but what America was fighting for. Once he finished the Social Security murals, he went to work for the Office of War Information.
And then he was, for the first time, disillusioned with government. He was obviously very much in favor of the victory of the Allies, but he was being frustrated more and more. His posters, he did a number of posters for them, and they were found to be too harsh, too tough. They were very, very effective, and very few of them, however, were produced.
The head people at the Office of War Information weren't particularly impressed with his work because they felt it was too depressing. I guess some people in the Office of War Information felt that that would be counterproductive somehow, that you wanted to be a little more upbeat, and they brought in an ad person. Shahn left the OWI. But while at the Office of War Information, he talks of having access to all of these classified documents, photographs in particular, that showed the devastation that was going on in Europe at that time. And it's the memory of those photographs that he then draws upon in many ways when creating paintings. He felt that there was a way in which looking at the particulars of people's everyday lives wasn't enough. This wasn't going to capture it. The extent of the devastation, of the hope, of the loss, of the sadness. And so he talked about moving towards a more universal, allegorical or symbolic realism, that there had to be ways in which you could create images that captured the sense of loss, the sense of hope, the sense of liberation.
I was recently asked, what do I paint? And I said, 3 subjects: aloneness, the impossibility of people to communicate with each other, which accounts for the aloneness, and thirdly, the sort of the indestructible spirit of man to keep on going beyond the time when he thinks it would be impossible to arrive anywhere. The recovery of those who enter back into an area that had been fought over and thoroughly destroyed.
So many children appear in his paintings during the war and after that they do represent something about that extreme sense of outrage over injustice. They're the next generation. They're the first out there to celebrate. They're looking for ways to play. His own children sometimes say in the poster for Roosevelt during 1944, it was his son that was being held up by the soldiers. So the particular and the universal.
Well, I met Ben in 1944 during the 4th term campaign for Franklin Roosevelt. The CIO, which was one of the 2 major labor organizations in the country, decided to set up a political action committee to help in the Roosevelt campaign. And Ben was a graphic arts director, and I was a young editorial writer who came in to write speeches.
It was a crusade. They described themselves as crusaders, not just workers. And Ben flourished. He really flourished.
This was not just a job to him. He was clearly identified with working people and poor people. So he brought to the CIO PAC a basic interest in trying to project their struggles.
I've done so much work that was strictly propaganda in the War Information Office for the unions for 2 years. I don't believe, really, that my painting has very much effect. I don't know. I think it has emotional effect, yes, but not in the degree of involvement that most people think of effect.
Allegory is one of those paintings where he really does bring it together for the first time, the universal and the particular. He's, in a way, summing up a series of experiences from his childhood in Vilcomere, from his childhood in New York City, from his experiences in the Office of War Information, where he sees photographs of piles of dead bodies in Eastern Europe, the beginnings of evidence of the Holocaust, his own inner fears and his own inner hopes that are also being experienced over a lifetime come out in this painting. The painting was done in 1948, and he had worked with this kind of fire beast earlier in the year in a series of illustrations he did in Harper's. And it was an article about a black man who had lost 4 of his children in a tenement fire in Chicago. He was playing there with, should he go for the symbolic, should he do the particular, and in that instance he did go for particular attributes of the family, their furniture, their homes in the South where they came from. But he did produce this kind of fire beast on the top of a burning tenement building, and this is what he used and evolved into the larger painting, Allegory, because he felt there was still something in that experience of fire and loss that hadn't been captured in the illustrations.
Ben was interested in the world, and his art was his reaction, actually, to every aspect of the world. His drawings expressed his feelings very, very deeply. He didn't consider drawing or illustration as a lesser art. He considered both of them as a form of expression, and each one had its own technique, its own requirements. People ordinarily think of illustration as something that people do in a kind of a casual way or do for money when they don't take it seriously. But I don't think that Ben ever did anything that didn't take seriously.
It was all a kind of artwork, and it was all a kind of trade, too, so that I think that was his approach to it. My father didn't. He kind of went out to his workshop in the morning, like a person who goes off to work, and the door was closed. You didn't go in there, so it wasn't something where I saw him working a lot. My father had kind of a little workshop, he had these neat little jars of paint that he kind of mixed up his own strange medium. He worked at a table. He didn't work on an easel. Sometimes he was wearing a tie when he worked, and it was very neat and precise, his place. And he didn't call it a studio even. It's interesting. He always said his shop rather than his studio, which is tells you something about how he wanted to be a workman of a certain kind and not an artiste.
Well, he was a superb draftsman. He did a great deal of illustration, of book illustration, of magazine illustration. He did covers for Time magazine, lots of articles for Harper's, for Scientific American, and he did advertising art. He did advertisements for the Container Corporation of America, not illustrating any product at all, just drawing attention to the Container Corporation. And these ads are still used in textbooks. In any case, he worked for a large advertising agency and did institutional advertising for the Columbia Broadcasting System. He was very much involved and liked what CBS was doing very much, and he did some beautiful work for them. He had a line that was absolutely identifiable as his, a kind of jagged line that was Ben Shahn. And if people pay attention, you see imitations of his work everywhere.
He came out of the commercial art world. His original training was as a lithographer, so that he knew about how you did these things and how the printing trades worked.
I would turn down things I'm not interested in. See, I didn't do my first commission, so-called commercial art. I was 44 years old. By that time, my aesthetic arteries had pretty well hardened, and nobody could make me do anything I didn't want or suggest any change or anything else.
He felt there was really very little distinction, that a commercial artist, meaning somebody who does it for money, was not that different from a fine artist. When he was given an assignment, he had to do the best he could, whatever it turned out to be. If it was an advertisement for the Container Corporation or for CBS, or whether it was just a painting to be shown in the museum, they had to be art, and they were. And they were for him. It was a great honor to have a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art, and I believe he was the youngest American to ever have one at that time. There have been many since then. There was a tremendous occasion, and it was very, very well received by a lot of people, except it came just at the time when Jackson Pollock was emerging as the American painter, and Clement Greenberg, who was perhaps controversial, but the most powerful figure in the art world of the time, gave Ben's exhibition a terrible review. This turned the tide as far as the art critics were concerned, not as far as the public was concerned. They bought anything he did. Even when he was really quite unpopular by the 60s, he sold, everything sold. But Ben wanted both. He wanted the public esteem, and he also wanted the critical attention. That he wasn't getting.
There was kind of in the 50s this feeling that realism was dead and that, anybody involved in realism was the enemy. And so Ben Shahn was to this group of people sort of the enemy. He was like representing a really conservative aesthetic. But at the same time, obviously politically, he was very, very progressive.
But the irony there was very obvious. This man who finally made it didn't make it. He lost it right away. But he was very concerned with the lack of content, and he was outspoken about it.
Look at the titling of some of the non-objective paintings. They sound like formulae out of books of physics. This is an effort to get close to that which is now the core of our society, and that is the sciences. But nevertheless, I feel that the artist who consciously isolates himself is isolating himself from the richest material that a human being can be exposed to, and that is the society in which he lives.
He was an intellectual. He was a man who used his mind a lot, who thought a great deal. And even if he didn't like a lot of what he saw, he realized there was something there. There was something missing in his own work. And his work did change. And from those who knew him well, including Bernarda, this was a great turning point for him. He started thinking about what he had done and what he was up to and what his future would be.
These works are finished, but at the same time, they do have this sense of process. And for Shahn, this could be seen as a loosening up, a playing with the ideas that were being discussed in the art world at that time. His support was really broad-based throughout his life in a way, but particularly in the 50s and 60s. He understood the importance of having a reputation in the fine art world and in the big museums, but there was a satisfaction that his art was being used for a particular purpose in many ways. This was the beginning of McCarthyism, the Cold War. Senator George Dondero of Michigan was attacking all modern art as communistic. And so Ben Shahn, as someone who was so supportive and so clearly connected with the New Deal, was seen as a communist. So he was dealing with two things. He was dealing with a shift in political climate, and he was dealing with a shift in the art world.
There was going to be a big Democratic convention in Philadelphia, and so CBS asked Ben if he would make a double-page spread for the New York Times to advertise the convention. So Ben made a double spread of television aerials, and then before the thing was published, he got a call from Bill Golden, the art director, and Bill asked if he would come in town to lunch, and in fact, both of us went in, and we had lunch with Bill, and he said that CBS had gotten a communication that if CBS used any more Shahn drawings, the CBS would be boycotted by this company, that company, another company. And Bill said, I have no alternative. I have to stop that big drawing.
Personally, he was boycotted by Columbia Broadcasting System, which was one of his big clients for his graphic work. And though Ben was blacklisted at CBS, he did certainly do work for Murrow. Nobody could fight Murrow at CBS.
Tonight, See It Now devotes its entire half hour to a report on Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, told mainly in his own words and pictures.
We were great friends with Ed Murrow, and when Ed finally did that critical piece on McCarthy, which was truly the end of McCarthy, Ben decided that he would make a big drawing.
His primary achievement has been in confusing the public mind as between the internal and the external threats of communism. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty.
Ben was never, by the way, a member of the Communist Party. He was too much the nonconformist. He was not a man who was going to go with the mobs. He was his own person.
He was not afraid to combine art and politics in a very straightforward way, that to be in a politically repressive time, artists had to come out of their studios, they had to take a stand. Even if the imagery was symbolic or allegorical and didn't deal directly with political issues, it did need to have accessibility. Art was about communication, the shape of content. I mean, art gave shape to content, and that content for him had to be accessible somehow.
Ben was an intelligent painter. He was an intelligent thinker. This series of lectures that he gave at Harvard, which were published under the name The Shape of Content, is brilliant. It should be, and it is, valued by huge numbers of art students today who might not even know his own painting. He was always extremely interested in fighting for the underdog, fighting for justice. These were all parts of his formation that didn't leave him.
One of Ben's most powerful expressions as an artist was the one that he called the Voyage of the Lucky Dragon. After the Bikini Island bomb testing, a man named Dr. Ralph Lapp had tested a group of fishermen who had been caught in the fallout. He wrote a story that Harper's printed. In fact, Harper's called Ben and asked if he would make pictures for this Voyage of the Lucky Dragon. But he couldn't stop at that. He did a beautiful drama, the whole thing, of the Voyage of the Lucky Dragon, which really was his statement against atomic energy.
I am a fisherman. These are my own words, of course. Akichi Kubayama by name. On the 1st of March, 1954, our fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon, wandered under an atomic cloud 80 miles from Bikini. I and my friends were burned, but we did not know what happened to us. On September 23rd of that year, I died.
I grew up almost in a different era, a different civilization. I mean, so much has changed, and so I try to think of what are the things that were part of that civilization and that aren't part of this. And I think a sort of an unquestioning faith in technology was something that was very accepted then. Now we have we understand in a sense that every technological advance kind of like leaves some garbage behind it, and I think my father kind of perceived that maybe, I think, precociously compared to most people. I mean, it's just a kind of humility in the face of phenomena in the universe.
I am against what I call scientism, which is not science at all. But it's the cult today of science. But as I say, it's scientism. And I thought these were the most appropriate words. Teach thy tongue to say, I do not know, and thou shalt progress.
He was fascinated by religion, by the symbolism of religion, by the ceremony of religion. You get a great deal of satisfaction from a church as he could from a synagogue. Without being a formally religious man, there was something higher. He wasn't ready to define it. But his work certainly turned to these religious themes.
He was going in the same direction that he began after World War II, searching for something that could speak at a more universal level. He was looking at the way in which artists and theologians and philosophers in times past had tried to create messages that did speak across time and across place. He was looking for ways in which to come to grips with a country that was once again being torn apart, not only by McCarthyism, but the civil rights movement, the demonstrations, the battles that were going on in the South. I don't see that much of a change in his politics in terms of what he was working towards in the 30s or 40s. The language changed, it had to. He had become older, he'd learned more things about what was possible and what wasn't possible.
As you get older, I can give you an image of a person being in a room with many doors. And when he was younger, each door he opened was a new vista. And now as you get older, you open the door and you say, I've been there. I've been there. It's a little bit disheartening. So that when one has the opportunity to find a new medium, it's an elation, and a revelation. And this has actually been begun. The cartoon, as it's called, a huge enlargement. And I'll be working on it now pretty steadily at the stained glass place in Philadelphia, in choosing the glass and so on. And I'm just going to keep my fingers crossed. That's all.
He was really brilliant and had this enormous curiosity. I think had he lived longer, he would have done more things, different things. No, he died too soon.
To learn more about Ben Shahn, visit PBS online at pbs.org. To order Ben Shahn, Passion for Justice on video cassette, call PBS Home Video at 1-800-PLAY-PBS. This program was made possible by the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the National Educational Telecommunications Association, the National Endowment for the Arts, the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, and the New Jersey State Council on the Arts.
This is PBS.